Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of In the Fire Garden. I know it's been a bit of a break here, but I'm here today with Joe Hall, the author of his new book, Fugue and Strike. Also, a Buffalo guy to tie into the last episode when I had Noah on the show. Joe Hall is a Buffalo-based writer and reading series curator. Sorry about that. His 5 books of poetry include Fugue and Strike, which just came out this year, so 2023, and Someone's Utopia. Then that was out in 2018. That's also Black Ocean. He has a number of books out with Black Ocean, which will be linked in the description. He has performed and delivered talks nationally at universities, living rooms, squats, and rivers. His writing has appeared in places as diverse as Post-Colonial Studies, Poetry Daily, Best Buds, Collective, Terrain.org, Peach Mag, Pen America Blog, Dollar Bills, and an NFTA bus shelter. He has taught poetry workshops for teachers, teens, and workers through Just Buffalo and the WNY Kosh Worker Center. You can get in touch with Joe at joehall.com. His website will be linked in the description, and then any kind of handles you can find him at. And the banner to this episode, the graphic I always make, the photo of Joe Hall in that picture, which is a great one, was taken by Patrick Cray. Sorry, Patrick. And you can find him on Instagram at Young Painkiller UNG, but I'll link him in the description as well. So, Joe, thank you for being here.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the being able to talk about the book.
Yeah. So to start, Joe, you're a very interesting guy. With all that I just read, because you have such a diverse background. You've been in lots of places, very accessible, very democratic of where you spend your time, who has access, who you reach out to, where your stuff appears, all that, which is great. You have your hands in a lot of projects because on your website you have a number of kind of collective publishing enterprises and stuff going on. Individually you teach. There's a lot of literary things happening around Buffalo that you're a part of as well. And so I'm just wondering, and then on Twitter, you have lots of diverse opinions into lots of different fields. So you're very well versed in kind of all the goings on in the world. So I just wanted to know then, so beyond being a great poet, being a writer and all that, what are some interests and passions then that drive you? And when you aren't writing, say, how are you spending your time?
Okay. Yeah. Boy, that's a complicated question, but yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of different things as you noted. I've worked in a lot of different weird workplaces. I've been laid off at a cannabis farm. I've worked at industrial printing presses, cooperative bookstores, as a secretary in a physics lab and as a teacher. But I was trained as a 17th century scholar in English literature, so that still remains an interest and a passion of mine. Part of that is looking at sort of the origins of capital. So believe it or not, like when I'm to entertain myself, I'm often reading academic articles. I just read a great one from my friend Allison Carden. Other things that I really care about. Are I work a communal garden with 3 friends of mine. So we've got 150 feet of garden on Wilson Street in Buffalo. So we're growing things, trying to protect them from the heat. And from there, yeah, I mean, of course, like I'm really interested in municipal and local politics and get really, really fired up about, how things work on the city level. The ways in which, like often cities like mine are ruled by kind of democratic machines that end up being really conservative when you scratch the surface. So really, learning about that, talking to folks who are doing that kind of work and getting involved when I can is something else that I've has been important, particularly within the last 4 years. Yeah, and I also play Dungeons and Dragons. I love Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, I just watched. This has nothing to do with the board game, but I just watched the Dungeon and Dragons movie, the new one that came out. Yeah, I mean, sure, it has a little bit to do with the board game, but nothing as complex as the game gets. I'm glad you brought up the your academic studies, because that was actually something that I thought was super interesting. So you received your PhD in Lit in 2018 from University of Buffalo SUNY, and I thought this was awesome. You did your dissertation on liquid commons in 18th century literature, which I just assume means academically you've written, and you've written a number of scholarly articles, but I assume those are kind of on water waste imperialism and how they're employed in literature and the dynamics that those create for kind of the societies in those texts. And I think this book, interestingly enough, utilizes that passion, that kind of interest. Certainly, we'll get into the strike component and the sanitation and the sort of urban planning of that, but I definitely think that ties in there so interestingly. So I was wondering then, how does your poetry and your academics interact? Do they often help each other, or is this kind of one of those things where they just so happen to right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it comes and goes a lot of the time. So for instance, my first book, Pigafetta is My Wife, was based off of research in regard to, Magellan's sort of circumnavigation of the world, and was working with one of the, accounts of that, the Journal of Antonio Pigafetta. So it was trying to think about early imperialism and and sort of turn those accounts inside out. And that involved a lot of research on the voyage and on the Philippines, where he was gloriously slain. And so that book came from that research. But the book after it, the devotional poems, was just pure sort of writing in sort of an ecstatic and associative way. So those processes are always in relationship to each other, and often the deeper into a research-based poetics I get, often the more sort of those other energies get charged, and I start writing in a more free form way. But certainly, I did spend a lot of time learning about the ways in which water was made property or imagined as part of imperial projects by the nascent British Empire in the 17th century. And I'm not writing directly about that in Fugue and Strike, but the sort of theoretical interests in regard to waste and its capacities inform it, as did a lot of sort of just the more careful methodologies, right? Like just researching something a little more tenaciously than I had before, has sort of filtered into this project, even though it's not scholarly and citational in the way that like an academic essay would be. But I just get really fired up, and it does actually deepen my imagination. The more I learn something, the more I absorb the vocabulary for that subject. I think that sort of learning allows me to sometimes say things that are maybe hopefully a little bit more interesting and insightful. And I just enjoy the process. Often if I am just writing without reading and learning, it does feel a little bit more like emptying out, right? Like if I'm writing in a more associative way, sometimes I think I'm exhausting what I know. So that those are some of the ways I've been thinking about that relationship.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. Like you said, that sometimes when there's you get more into that ecstatic or just like you're saying devotional mode, you definitely you feel different than when you have maybe something that you're channeling. Like you said, you're emptying yourself out, whereas when with the research you're helping to kind of fill yourself up, and then you feel so at times it can be a bit more balanced maybe of an expenditure, that and you don't leave yourself as depleted sometimes when maybe you're just drawing on all those kind of inner spiritual reserves. I loved your book and its researches and all that, because interesting enough, I was a sociology major at school. I kind of swerved away from it because I'm an English teacher, but one of the professor that I kind of took as a mentor, he would always talk about urban planning and the importance of it in shaping society and everything. So I thought that I was like, oh, when I was reading your book about all your great history into the strike and everything, I'm like, oh wow, this is a sociology book. And I like that you mentioned that it's different citationally or formally than an article, but I really love in this book that you have these poem essays in them. Essentially is kind of what they are. It's this great blending of forms, this great hybrid text that you create. And so I was wondering, aesthetically, when you're like, and you talked about it a bit, but when these two energies kind of blend together and they kind of fuse, and it's hard to kind of maybe tell them apart. But when you're working in that way and they're kind of fusing, how do you know when you yourself are going on like a academic article route versus a poem route? Is there a point when they converge? Because you have sources for lots of stuff in here, but it could be easy enough to take the sources out and just put them in the footnotes like you have, versus as to kind of put them in. So when does the feeling kind of take over? When do you ride the feeling? It's like, oh, okay, this is definitely going to be more of a poem. I don't want this to be an article, versus like, oh, this is going to be something I submit to an academic journal.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a more complicated answer for this, but I don't know if I do. I think as a PhD student, I had to write academic articles, and to write a dissertation, I had to create this, big substrate of, like citational prose, and to get the sort of jobs I imagined I was going to get. I would start writing articles, and try to get those published. And I do really enjoy that process, and it is immensely satisfying. But I did find once the heat was off to publish academic articles, it seemed as if my natural stance or my natural impulse was to just feed all that research into poetry. um, that being said, I think coming into Garbage Strike, I think there might have been some touch and go there, in the sense of I was doing a lot of research and thinking about the shape of it, and I didn't quite know what shape it would be, but I knew that I was open to making it more than an academic article, or not an academic article. And there was like a long period of simply building up notes and wondering what the shape of those notes would ultimately be. But I kind of knew in the back of my head that if I was giving myself permission to write an academic article, it wouldn't be an academic article. And it was just going to matter what the balance and relationship between, the sort of more prosodic thinking and associative thinking would be. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's great. So for you, why? I think we all have different questions, all writers too. Why the form they write in is what they write in. I often I feel like it kind of all boils down to the same answer of it just is the way that it came out at one point in time. But why do you think poetry for you? Was there a time when maybe you wanted to be a short story writer or a novelist or an essayist or even a journalist? I could see you being a killer journalist too. So when did kind of poetry you're like, this is it, this is my thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when poetry, yeah, I mean, I'm probably sometimes too shy to be a journalist, or overthink things too much to work on a journalistic deadline. I mean, not that journalists like don't think deeply and learn deeply, they do, but sometimes I get too lost in the sauce of actually writing to be an efficient journalist. So for me, I mean, like a lot of people, I started writing stories in high school, and thought maybe that would just be something I did on the back burner in college. But I sort of, had one of these happy accidents where, I took a introduction to creative writing class at St. Mary's College of Maryland, and worked with this great poet, Jeff Coleman. And I remember just really, really sort of having this endless energy for poetry. Even when I had other things to do, I found myself writing, more poems than were assigned, right? Like more poems than, like Professor Coleman wanted. And so it just seemed to be this place that I was returning to make meaning of the world, and to feel like I was had some sort of center or anchor in which I was, sort of like taking all the chaotic stuff going around me and grounding it. So I asked him the first, maybe with a month within the class, I was like, hey, will you meet with me every week to talk about my poetry? And I didn't realize like what a insane ask that was of someone who's, a younger professor, someone really, really busy and overloaded. But he said yes, and I'm eternally grateful for that. And he tolerated, like several months worth of my very bad poems, meeting with him. And from there, I sort of had the good luck of there being this really, really open-ended poetic infrastructure at St. Mary's College of Maryland, because the poet Lucille Clifton was there, and she was able to bring some incredible thinkers and writers there. I mean, in my time there, Lee Young Lee read, W.S. Merwin read, Toni Morrison came to campus, to this little public college's campus. Wojciech Slienka. So unwittingly, I was getting exposed to these incredible people, and was able to sit in on conversations, that Lucille Clifton would have with these writers, and those really impacted me, as well as just being able to sit in her classes. So I that fire was I was able to get that kind of input, and incredible input, for a long time, um, at a really pivotal point in my poetic development. So I owe a lot to Lucille Clifton, Michael Glazer, and Jeff Coleman, at St. Mary's College of Maryland. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what powerhouses to to come through there. I think
Yeah.
Wole Soyinka was professor at UNLV for quite a while. And I never went to UNLV, but obviously I live in Vegas, and I'm bummed that I just missed the chance to like just meet him at some point in time. I would have gone down there for like some event or something that he was doing, but I don't think I was aware of it until it was too late. And now it's like, oh damn, he was at UNLV.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so hard to know. Like, you often don't realize how enormous these people are. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I want you to read some stuff from Fugue to us and introduce us. But before that, we'll dive in with this question about your relationship with Black Ocean, because you've worked with Black Ocean now for quite a bit, which is interesting. I love Black Ocean. I had another Black Ocean author on the Fire Garden too. Black Ocean's always putting out such great stuff. But in this time with so many press and everything, it's not unusual for maybe like authors with big presses to continuously work with the same houses. But now, especially in poetry, the poetry world, it seems like poets have so many books with different places, also just because of the nature of publishing schedules. If you have like two manuscripts, you don't want to wait like all these different years for them to come out, so you'll send them away. But you having a continued presence in the Black Ocean catalog, I think, is very interesting. So I'm wondering what that continuity, what influence that has had shaping your books and your poetry, if that's been something that you've given much thought to, and how that evolution, that relationship and your poetry has evolved over time, just working within kind of that, with those same voices or that same kind of support system.
Yeah. So I think I've been incredibly lucky. I sent them a manuscript, my first, after I, received my master's in fine arts, maybe the month after I graduated, and it was accepted maybe 5 months later. So I was saved a lot of the sort of pain, and or just irritation of having to like send things and get rejected, like that can be incredibly demoralizing. So I've been very lucky, and I didn't know they were going to keep working with me, with the devotional poems, and it was somewhere around. And when they did, I felt incredibly lucky. And I think sometime around there, they did say that they were interested in working with their authors in the longer term, sort of like how Black Sparrow did. And it has shaped my work in the sense that I felt more free. And I'm again grateful for that, because I know that when you're submitting contests, you're constantly self-aware of, what presses will take your manuscript, whether it's a marketable manuscript or not. So I have felt a lot of creative freedom. I don't think I would be sort of staking a book, to a long poetic, essay toggling between prose and poetry, that is in Fugue and Strike, if Black Ocean weren't my publisher, and if I didn't know they would seriously consider taking, the next manuscript down the pipe. So yeah, it has changed things, and I'm really trying to go for it in my next book too. Like, just imagining them as my first reader, and knowing that they are open to really different shapes in which my manuscripts can take. So yeah, I feel really lucky. And the some of the poets I admire the most are sort of people who can reinvent themselves and write in a different way as the situation demands, and write a different book with every book. And I actually think that's easier with Black Ocean. So I'm, yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, because I think that the stability that maybe having a press that believes in you and is willing to at least for sure at least have a open mind to any project you approach them with is definitely very freeing, because like you said, it can be you can get in your head too much when you're trying to shape a manuscript to a particular contest or whatever. But about this book, Fugue and Strike, phenomenal book. So much to talk about in there. I don't want us to talk about anything in there before we get it, before listening to some of it. So if you have some sections queued up that you'd like to read, I'd love for you to share that with us.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I know you said I could read for about 10 minutes, so I'm gonna get a
I,
timer
yeah,
going.
but feel free to, if you go beyond that, like 10 is this kind of a number that people generally toss out as like a comfortable number to them. But if you go over 10, it's not a big deal.
Okay, sure. So yeah, I'm gonna start. The book is in two sections. The fugues are a little more associative. They're kind of dealing with all the chaos of and disorientation of 2020, the uprisings, what was going on in Buffalo, bad jobs, really, having good friends, being sort of like washed out of the academia for a little bit. And then I'm going to move to the garbage strike poems. So poems that are sort of thinking about how waste has been used militantly across time, as well as sort of the economies of labor and labor organizing surrounding waste and sanitation work. So anyway, yeah. So I'm going to start with some fugues. This is fugue number 6, Jack Dads of Cornell. Jack Dads of Cornell are in the spirit door, the star door, where lo, long I walk through the valley of food, and all that food multiplying in the sphere. To become a poet is to kill a poet, cling to a poet in the last hour before slipping into the drift. Atoms of talk bounce in cylinders down Green Street, predictive tongue in the aleatory frame stream of baticides. In the valley of food, Jack Dads of Cornell blowing warp whistles, tech bros seduced into a sort of almost graspable grammar. Pleasure without vulnerability. Rob them totally. Leave them drifting tongueless before the pulp versus the throne. That's the title of Carrie Lorig's book, the title of this poem, The Fugue Zone, number 6, Jack Dads of Cornell. Here's a bad job poem. This is called Fugue 20, Consumer Cooperative Bookstore. De-skilled in vomiting gold fog. The register, the factory. Their words stepping on the pedal of your tongue. Email de-skilled my tongue. How it could hover with your raw parts. Vomiting gold. Vomiting gold. You bag a book. Watch it go through the bindery and pulp at both ends. On Monday, the manager confiscates your N. On Friday, your O. You try to say no. There's just a scab in the air. During the Friday rush, you think you're being eaten alive by a pack of small dogs. On Monday, you realize, no, that's too dramatic. You're just a chew toy for know-it-all adjuncts of the ruling class, which might be worse. Anyway, you go to say this to your coworker, but you're both vomiting gold.
I'll say that I just love the cadence of your performances of these, because they definitely feel like uh, performances more than readings for sure.
Yeah.
Not like in a overly self-conscious way, but definitely in the you get into it and then they just kind of come out in a very moving uh, rhythm.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Yeah. I mean, I try to serve the poem, I try to make them all different. Find what the voice of each poem is, and connect with it. Yeah. Um, so yeah, I think I think we're gonna go to uh the garbage strike stuff. And I think I'm gonna end. I think I have time. I mean, this isn't going to be poetry, so for everyone here who's into poetry, my apologies. But for me, this is part of the infrastructure of the book that makes the poetry possible. So I'm going to read a piece called Polymer Meteor, and it's the end of the book, and it comes way after um, this sequence, which is thinking about waste, which is presenting some hyper compacted poems with really fragmentary language that deal with waste, and then also things that are sort of talking about the history of garbage strikes and people using waste to protest, like the Young Lords burning their garbage in the street to get New York City to pick it up. And so this poem Polymer Meteor is kind of a reflection on all these things, and sort of speculating on how they come together. So this is called Polymer Meteor. George Oppen wrote in discrete series, rooms outlast you, pithy, and also indicative of a relation to time that is modest, sobering. We die, apartments go on. Their floors get scratched by someone else's chairs. Their vents fill with the dust of someone else's life. But those rooms also go, demolished to make way for some other, pricier structure. Or those rooms are split open by moisture and creatures seeking shelter in a zone of divestment, a frame of time in which things live decades to centuries. When I was 32, I saw the green thread of a seedling peeking out of a tub drain. A tangle of my partner's hair and coconut oil shampoo held the seed in the drain where it was rinsed by our showers. I squatted in the shower, pulled the plug of hair and seedling, then held this assemblage in my naked, damp hand. Where did the seed come from? I'd been eating flax seeds with my oatmeal. This one must have escaped the coffee grinder in my teeth, traveled placidly through yards of my intestine, and because of its glutinous hull, got stuck in the hairs of my dank parts after a shit until I showered. My consumption had failed to destroy. That which was shit was already blooming. This drained seedling was my small window into a pre-modern world of fast cycling matter. One's refuse didn't always travel far. Dinner scraps shot back to life from the heap. Though the majority of people and things live short lives, they also live short and public afterlives. It wouldn't be strange to think that what was lost or tossed would return, or the thread of its life would wind its way into a different vessel. If time, endurance were weight before and alongside industrial modernity, many things must have seemed light. And if life didn't last, what endured was its medium, soil. A Renaissance master gardener, quote, "There is nothing but what may serve to amend that earth or soil, returning to it by way of corruption, under whatever figure it returns to it. All manners of stuff and linen and flesh, skin, bones and nails of animals, dirt, urines, excrement, the wood of trees, their fruit, their leaves, ashes, straw, all manner of corn or grains, and etc. Rooms outlast us. But the contents of an already unresellable self-bone will outlast the room. It will outlast most soils. Petroleum-based polymers will take their place alongside the mineral, exerting their own kind of geology, a geological force that may outlast the assemblages of power that birthed it, long after they boil themselves to death through carbon emissions. So given that we, flesh, are affiliated with so many polymer immortals, I would like to suggest we imagine future time as present weight in order to see the world. If long after our bodies die, the case of a cell phone lives on into the thousands of years, its mass multiplied by all that time, it would be unliftable. It would break your floors. Our world is full of things swirling with the potential and marvelous mass of asteroids. And these things will become particles of long-chain polymers, rinds of code, and electronics turn leach it, chemistry spilling across virtual and material borders, attenuated bacteria and fungi blooming in subterranean, oceanic, and tropospheric masses, new ecologies. Karen Brodeen, the great socialist feminist type-sitting poet, wrote, "Make your hands move quickly on the keys, fast as you can, while you are thinking about the layers, fossils. The idea is that this machine she controls is simply layers of human work hours frozen in steel, tangled in tiny circuits, blinking out through lights like hot red eyes. As long as our labor is lost to ourselves and those we'd be in solidarity with, might these tangles of junk be our final purgatorial vessel? That is, as long as we labor in normal time and do not or cannot enter revolutionary time, or maybe we should call it solidarity time." Foam of an office chair, a name tag, some pounded on keys, this dock perpetually reanimated by the energy of an archive, our hot red eyes mute, frozen except for the slow blink of consciousness to a poet like Brodeen. And capitalists will work future generations into these geologies of human residue. From Xi Jingnan's great poem entitled, quote, "Production in the middle of production is soaked by production." In links, by deep links, deeper and deeper links, then I'm baffled by the light. I'm a railroad tie under the light. This is not a pop-up for organic farming, metal straws, or a compost theology, but towards an understanding of the distributions of endurance and force. This is to say, we're constantly shedding 10,000-pound nails, sweating out ponds of oil, shitting forests. Imperfectly aligned with capitalist production, a thumb over the hose, a wild chaotic force in an orbit that we channel into open-ended projects of opposition and solidarity. Solidarity. Here's Dario Azzolini in Communes and Workers' Control in Venezuela. Quote, "An open category constituted in struggle, which people can join." I dream of the time when it is the red hot eyes of executives and cops looking out from the rubble, the decommissioned salvage yards, where these liquidators no longer get to enjoy oblivion or put their name on monuments substituted for public goods. Rather, the liquidators are finally frozen in the rubble, stuck as the mute and frustrated ghosts of a savage time.
Awesome. Phenomenal. Thank you for reading that. I'm glad you read that one because in my notes here, I just had a little line that just said, "Ask about polymer meteor. This is a great poem essay," because I just wanted to know about it. So I'm glad that that you read it, because that was great to listen to you read it with that intensity, but then also the kind of preface you did for it as well, which I think answers gives us everything we need to know about it, as tying into everything. And like you said, serves as, even though it comes at the end, it's very central to everything in the book, and coming at the end ties everything together. But what you just reading it, I think, preliminaries everything that we need to know about the, well, certainly in the structure of it, because like you said, the strike portion of the poem is somewhat, the book is somewhat like that, and that you have those essayistic kind of components, but then like you said, they're broken up with the more associative poem-looking poems. So I think that your section of reading the Fugue with the polymer meteor gives us really the perfect ends of what your book brings to the table here. And I love the title of the book, which is something that I always hone in on. But I feel like your title is perfect because it's so strikingly simple, in that it's not a complicated like 2000s pop punk title of songs, when it's just really long things that you can't make ends meet out of. But rather, yours are just two very very important words that tie into the book, but then are also somehow actions as well. We have fugue as the interweaving of themes, but then also that dissociative state that I think that your book is telling us the capitalism or the environment, the corporations or the elite classes that are trying to, like you note, kind of control things force upon people, and then you have strike, which is an action that takes place in the book. But then the match illustration on the front, I think, does a good job of noting what you want the strike to be, which is to strike the individual consciousness into a kind of collective revolution or collective realization of their conditions. So when you were designing this book, obviously you had your fugues, that section, you had that, but then was that always kind of like the organizational idea, like, oh, I have these two concepts? Or how did the concepts of this book come together? Were these two different projects that originally, like the fugues and then the strike essay poem, and then you saw that some balance between them and you fused them? Or were they maybe like two different books that you had to then maybe rework a little bit?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, yeah, the genesis of a book can be really complicated, and this was one of those. Yeah, because the fugue poems I had written and am still writing, and I have like 300 of them, like so many pages, and like they just wouldn't stop. But so for a while I was like, oh, maybe I'll just write this enormous book of fugues. But ultimately, I don't think, they sort of have these different phases which don't necessarily speak to each other. And so the ones that are here are sort of written at the beginning of this project in 2019 into 2020. And I think they're a little like crazier, or a little more like, and they're a little more absurd, or they try to use humor a little bit more. um and the so I realized, like, I didn't want to publish all the fugue poems as one, because they wouldn't really work as a book, or with the sort of integrity I'd want them to. And at the same time, like, yeah, I was writing the strike essay in 2019, and into the pandemic. So I decided that, like, what I wanted was to take the parts of these projects that were both written concurrently, during the same, like, historical moment and same sort of mindset space for myself, and to put them together. Because I wrote many of the few poems while working in a labor library. That was the same labor library where I did the research for strikes. And so they came together like that. And also, yeah, I mean, I wanted to give the reader something that was, on one hand, anchored by prose, and on the other, a little more sort of just zeitgeisty and structure of feelingy, and just sort of like riding an associative wave, and to let those inform each other in a certain way. But it took a long time to get there, and it took a lot of false starts and a lot of different ideas for what the shape of the book might be before I finally settled on it. And in a lot of ways, it's the story of a book that just got shorter and shorter and shorter. Yeah.
I, that's great, because that answers another question about the fugues, because they're numbered all sorts of different ways. So I was wondering if you if there was some sort of system, but now it makes sense. You just kept the ones that fit for the project. uh, Poetry is going through an interesting moment right now where I mean, it's not necessarily new to this moment versus any other poetic movement, where poets are always arguing with each other about what a poem is and everything like that. And so you have different camps, but no matter what formal restrictions or formal requirements people try to mandate versus the more democratic, like, everything, what's a poem has no definition or whatever. I think all writers of poems have some sort of constraint they put upon themselves to define what they're after in a poem, to a degree. Sometimes, like you said, it's very associative and you don't really know. But I feel like we all have some constraints that we like to impose upon ourselves, at least for some semblance of order in this very chaotic kind of system. So for you, for the fugues, I was wondering if you have anything that you're operating, if any kind of framework you're operating within that you like to impose on those things to determine, like, this is a fugue poem as opposed to any other kind of poem.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think figuring out those, Denise Levertov had this idea of organic form, which is like you find the form of the thing as it emerges through writing it. And to me, that's true to a certain degree, but not always. And a lot of times I was, I don't always know about the idea of the word organic, but I did want to start writing poems that were anchored by repetition, but not, sort of repetition of entire lines or end rhyme or anything like that. And so I knew that the fugue poems would have these sort of callbacks as they were written, and they would each try to be anchored by a phrase or that would repeat over and over. But I would do that in a way that was a little more intuitive. And a lot of them are structured in some ways by at least starting with certain runs of slant rhyme or things like that. So thinking about like repetition of content and repetition of sound in a somewhat open-ended way. I also knew I would be working with longer lines at a certain point. So those were sort of loose constraints. Other constraints I picked up and put down along the way, like repeating the title of the poem at the end, almost like a hustle. And from there, there's something that is like I'm not quite sure about because I haven't actually scanned it out, but my book Someone's Utopia, the one I wrote before this, I had an enormous draft of it. Like, yeah, I had a big pile of stuff, and I was driving down Coastal Highway 1, listening to a metal tape that my friend had given me, and sort of thinking about the manuscript while I was on book tour, and just being like, all right, what is binding this manuscript together? What is the common connective tissue? How do I find its form? And ultimately, it was just sort of this rhythm that came to me. That was emergent in it. And I sort of went to a hotel one day and started rewriting the entire manuscript to follow a certain rhythm, right? That I felt was going to structure the poems. And so, like, I'm not sure if that's as much here in Fugue and Strike, but certainly, like, just sort of like a loose sense of rhythm is often there too, in terms of the voice of the poem and the flow of the poem. So yeah.
No, that makes perfect sense, and you can definitely pick up the kind of fugal rhythm, because you definitely, and it makes it all the more apparent when you counterpose it with the strike component, and then you definitely feel like maybe a different kind of consciousness is leading the reader through that one. So I think the fugal rhythm is really brought all the more to the surface when you get to the prose section and you look back on that, and then the rhythm, the drastic change in rhythm really alerts you to just how rhythmic the other section was. So I think that's a great kind of lesson for someone to take away from like a craft building perspective of a book building. Like, oh, look the way that rhythm is conjured up and brought to life by contrasting those rhythms like that. I love the in piece to the fugue section that you have, fugue zone process notes, a language for exhaustion, because I think a language for exhaustion is so, like you said, in uh, provocative of the zeitgeist of kind of language right now, especially with language feeling like it. It's something so innate and personal and intimate between us, but also in so many ways feels like policed, or certainly policed by us to some degree, but also like it's policed uh unconsciously by other motives and other like are going to argue in the strike component that there's always some sort of upper hand that's pushing down on these things. And one example that we get at, you hear so often online or just colloquially, is the way people talk about work, just like that work should be your life, or they talk in ways that are serving the employer, like the employer is some personal friend that they're letting down by not working as much. And to me, when I that's what I get from exhausted language, that you get that idea of the possibilities of language being kind of exhausted because they're not free to be as infinite or as limitless as possible, because they're so pressed down upon by these more elite forces, we can say. So I think that's one of the effects of capitalism that you're getting at here in an abstract sense. I like that the few kind of explores the abstract, maybe consequences of, or the associative consequences of capitalism, and the strike deal you give us kind of that very materialistic picture of the consequences. So maybe theoretically here, this is maybe too theoretical, but what happens to in your mind, what happens to language and its users then when we're exhausted or using in a language exhaustively and everything. Is that was that one of the kind of concerns that you were interested in here? Because I know that capitalism isn't a concern to you resourcefully with water and everything, but it definitely seems like you're also exploring the that kind of more micro, not even micro, just like ethereal level of capitalism's consequences as well.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if yeah, I think, I don't know if I was thinking about that explicitly, what capitalism does to language. But on the other hand, as I wrote this, I think it's imminent to a lot of poetry, which is, the normative ways of using language are so infested by the mythologies of capitalism, and infested by sort of these value systems which invite us to like be self-exploiting even, and not only to like be exploited. um and so I think many poets are operating from that sense of like, to write in late capitalism, you do have to make language new because language is itself being exhausted and and instrumentalized by capital. I've really returned to the phrase of Buck Downs, the poet Buck Downs, who often says like we're often being invited to sort of, and he's talking about social media spaces, but like strip mine our vulnerability, right? And what I sometimes think about that is like the language of love, the language of trauma, the language of forgiveness, in many ways can be sort of commodified and monetized, and is also just being fed into to machines, which are going to then sort of like be used to produce language through like the data that we're providing through it. So like, like most online speech is already cathected by a sort of like unconscious value creation, by capital and Silicon Valley. And so like that should make us all wary and nervous and skeptical of how we use language, I think, in certain ways. um so the poem itself is a way of maybe hopefully escaping some of that exhaustion of language. Like when I say working associatively, like often that means locating the meaning not within the denotative sense of the word, right? Like the dictionary definition of the word, but through the kind of constellations of connotations that occur when you're jamming unlikely words together with each other, and unlikely concepts and contexts with each other. So I do think that that might be one way in which, like poetry can be a little bit like fugitive, in terms of like of capturing language and its meanings, is through those sort of connotative fields, the meanings that that emerge through sort of the gaps in language. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I don't want us to end here before talking about the garbage strike section because it's such a pivotal thing, and you research it so thoroughly, and and it's such a passionate part of the book. So it has its own sort of section here: Buffalo and Ithaca, New York, January through May 2019. But then it also takes us through a whole historical overview of strikes and sanitation, like you mentioned, and not just New York specifically at times, and then deals race, class, all those different kind of conflicts that have dealt with getting people their rights for, or what sanitation strikes have led to in terms of labor organization, all that. But dealing with Buffalo, like you saw and everything, what was the impact of that strike and the conflict there, and just overall, what do you think the importance of like this piece is to the universal like spirit of your book? Why was it such a, to you, did you feel it was such an integral part to include here, that it really possessed so much of your time and your life for a while researching it?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, part of it was I was working in a labor library, and I had access to all of this material, so it was just sort of opportunity. But the other part is, like this was, written during the the Trump years, during the uprisings of 2020, the pandemic. And I think the world, like, I think people's sense of possibility, both in terms of negative possibility and liberatory possibility, the capacity for system change, right? Like, or radical changes to systems became, you know, maybe not obvious, but it was on people's horizon. Like, holy shit, the government can just give us money, right? Like, oh, holy shit, the government, are, as an expression of racial capitalism, like is killing black people, like in a disgusting and gratuitous way. So and holy shit, like people in Buffalo, they're like thousands and thousands of them, like showing out to protests every day. So you get both those sort of set of events and horizons, in quick succession to each other, right? Sort of like the concrete expressions of how bad things are, right? The mask is off, and those of what people can accomplish, hopefully working together. And so for this strike, I think that the strike is so important to me, just given what I learned in regard to what it could accomplish and what it takes to happen. Because strikes, when people are saying, okay, we're going to stop as a group going to work, that requires an enormous amount of solidarity, right? Like getting everybody on board, working cooperatively together. And it also, the more I would learn about it, just required like an immense amount of preparation. And like building up a strike fund, right? Making this group resilient and able to weather, sometimes like months and in some cases like years on strike. So that's like an incredible amount of like human energy. And whereas a strike may seem spontaneous, it's also planned. It's like a conscious long-term effort to like build and use power to improve things from the bottom up. So for me, like that's what's so interesting about strikes, for me. And that sort of organizing, that sort of long-term collective work, to build organizations and build solidarities that are resilient enough to accomplish something like a strike that wins. To me, like that's the work right now, like that's the work that we need to carry forward, even um during these years of backlash, right? Like there's an intense backlash to, the uprisings of 2020. There's an intense backlash to like some of the social safety gains that were made during the pandemic. Like it's all getting peeled back, right? Uh, so, um, so yeah, so strike, what a strike represents, very needed. And I wanted to think through it. And also waste, I think waste was a way to talk about both union workers, people trying to unionize, sanitation workers, but also community groups, a way to talk about both race and waste, a way to talk about gender and waste. So as a category, like I can think beyond just sort of like formal wage labor, by thinking about waste, right? Because waste labor is often racialized and feminized. Black workers and workers of color are often the people who have to do waste work. Women are often the people who have to clean shit up, right? So yeah, so that's sort of how those things came together. I hope that makes sense or wasn't too long-winded.
No, I love that, and I loved that particular section of the book because it made me think about uh, so many of the strikes here, or that were potentially going to be here, that were so important, and like you said, how hard they are to carry out. I remember, and I thought it was also so symbolic that the sanitation strike, the waste strikes, are so important and powerful when it's such, like you said, an unpretty element. But when you reflect on it, how necessary it is, it's like, of course, that's where power would originate, because no one wants to deal with that. And once they see that they have to deal with that, they're
Yeah,
like, oh
yeah,
shit,
and
we
in
definitely
civilizations, cities shut down if nobody is taking out the garbage.
yeah.
Like it gets bad real fast.
And in Vegas, there was one. I can't remember how long ago it was now. It's fairly recent, within the last decade. But there was a culinary workers strike, and that had huge ramifications for all fields. We all sort of benefited from the gains that the culinary workers won, and so, like you said, a single movement just has such widespread effects for everybody, and the bravery that they took to do that had a huge impact on teachers, even in some gains that we
Mm,
made. And then it wasn't until the teachers were talking about going on strike that you realized just how difficult of a task the culinary workers pulled off in their strike,
mm,
because just being in, listening, talking to teachers about the potentiality of a strike. This was when the union was still even voting on, like, oh, are we going to strike? And you when behind the scenes you understood as a teacher how DOA the strike was before it even kicked off. Like, before they were even going to take a vote, you're like, oh, no one's going to strike. This isn't going
mm,
to happen. And so, like you said, just the ability to gather, to have that unity and the solidarity and pull it off is so hard to do when so many other fields who have talked about strike, you actually are within the fields, you're like, oh shit, we're never going to strike. There's not going to be enough people who are going to hold the line against that.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Academia needs to get its act together. Yeah, there's in that regard. Yeah, but I mean, it's doing well. There's tons of good grad student strikes, but many institutions with faculty who understand all this, yeah, cannot organize or get themselves together. Yeah, but anyway,
Yeah,
that's another thing. Yeah.
definitely. But thank you, Joe, for hanging out. Before we close and everything, I was wondering if there's like another poem or something that you think is a great send off poem that you want to read us out with.
Yeah, I'll read I mean, I don't know if it's a great send-off poem, but it's a poem I like to read. It's maybe one of the oldest books and oldest poems in the book. Um, and it's kind of like a straightforward poem, I think. And it's called it's this one kind of doesn't fall in either section particularly neatly. There's a few like that towards the end. But it's called The Wound. First, you want to light the candle. Then I want to light the candle to make the world this small at midnight. The axis of the week, one burning thought. A little ball of myrrh releases. I've learned each lesson too late. What does the candle say? Look at me. This book says, let it burn. I can't love those who say, let it burn. I don't love who I was, laying down in the dark memory of the day to watch a video a friend recorded with 100 beautiful strangers singing. Shut it down. How fine the line between shut and burn. The screen dissolves. Cheryl is not yet home. Accuracy without ambition. That's all I can ask for from a poem.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe, for joining me here on this episode of the Fire Garden. And everybody who tuned in, thank you. I appreciate you all. Joe's book, Fugue and Strike, right here, out from Black Ocean Press. The link to Black Ocean and the book will be in the description. Joe's website, joehall.com, will be in there. With the graphic that is the thumbnail for this, he has a great live action shot of him reading. It's taken by young painkiller Patrick Cray, who will also be linked should you want to check out his work. Joe, I'm going to link your website, but is there a way for people to contact you if they wanted to besides your website?
Yeah, I mean they can go to joehall.com. All of my monikers, on Instagram and Twitter are both just at Joe Hall. And if I ever make it to other social media, it'll also be at Joe Hall. So yeah, you can find me there. And yeah, get
Awesome.
in touch. Tell me about garbage. I want to hear it.
For sure. So all Joe's important information will be linked in the description, along with the link to buy the book, which I really hope everyone does because it's excellent. Black Ocean always produces beautiful books, not just content wise, but also textually, just great artifacts, these things. So, Joe, thanks again for stopping by, and see you all again on the next episode with the next guest.
All right. I appreciate it.